army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to Chasing Ghost, an irregular warfare podcast. Today is episode 81. Title is Strategic Empathy, Grokking the Pendulum of Indecision. So a little bit of housekeeping is in order. We complete our move from the southwest Florida Gulf Coast up to the Panhandle, proximate to the Alabama border. Here in the free state of Florida, we have closed on our house and are almost on the brink of actually moving into it. Boy, it felt really good to wire the money for our house, and now we will be, well, presently we are, the owners of a house that is paid for with no mortgage whatsoever. What those of you in the audience will discover who have purchased houses in the past, whether you paid cash for it or you had a mortgage, when we went to the title company to do this very thing, the paperwork was probably a quarter of an inch tall, whereas if we had had a mortgage as we have in the past, it would have been about 3 inches tall. So that was really good. And very excited to set up my new podcast studio, my new office, and get my books out of bloody storage. I did not realize how much I have relied on my considerable library, Umberto Eco's library, that is both a library and an anti-library, because I used a lot of reference works for this podcast and my avocations and hobbies in researching what's gone on in the world before, what's happening now, and what does that tell me about the future. So I can't wait, and finally I will have the room to take my almost complete collection of the Journal of Military History published by the Virginia Military Institute, which takes up almost an entire shelf all by itself. I'll be able to at last take that out of the containers that they are in presently, have them up there, and start, once I retire, which is happening soon enough. I can't wait to delve into those and start reading those, maybe from start to finish, selecting various articles and things like that. But I will have roughly, let's do the calculation here, nearly 4 decades of military history that's been published. By the way, military history as a profession, like the classics departments that teach Greek and Latin and look at those now dead civilizations, to include Rome, of course, and Greece, of course, and everything in between and contiguous to them, they're dying on the vine. You would be hard-pressed if you sought a postgraduate degree in which your specialty was military history to find an academic reception center or modality in America, if not overseas, that would let you delve into that, because a lot of historians, especially from the 2 leading historical associations here in America, view military history as a bastard stepchild, as an illegitimate faction. And I always try to remind myself that if one is a doctor, it doesn't mean that you believe in disease and cancer as a positive assignation in society. It's simply that you are trying to ameliorate, stop, or altogether cure patients, clients, people who are suffering from said diseases. And ignorance or a willful exception to even studying military history is not going to end well, as both Mark Twain and George Santayana told us when it comes to history repeating itself, whereas it may not repeat itself, but it necessarily rhymes, and that one must look back in history to tell you what the future portends if you pay enough attention to it. Military history, as I've mentioned before, is one of those fascinating academic and non-academic pursuits in which the more you read, or the more you listen, or the more you interview about or discuss with folks who happen to have the same very narrow interest that you do, the more you can comprehensively, if your mind is open to examining these things prismatically and from contrarian perspectives, you gain a greater appreciation of that phrase that I'm so fond of, the single most accurate picture of what something is. Now, that may be a bit misleading because as an engineer, I want to bore you with a distinction between accuracy and precision. Accuracy is how close a measurement is to the true accepted value, correctness, while precision is how close a set of measurements are to each other, consistency, reproducibility. Accuracy measures systematic error, the bias, while precision measures random error. Now, I know for those of you who may not be mathists or engineers, you wonder what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, what it has to do with is that since in accuracy, that indicates the closeness to the target or true value of what you're trying to assess, precision is sort of the relative to other values weighed within the same set or subset of things that you're examining. So let me give you an example by using darts as a game. High accuracy and high precision, all darts hit the bullseye. Low accuracy, high precision, all darts are grouped tightly together but far from the bullseye, systematic error. High accuracy and low precision, darts are spread out but their average position is in the bullseye. And low accuracy, low precision, the darts are scattered everywhere. Now, what in the world does this have to do with what we're going to be discussing today, which is the distinction between situational awareness and situational understanding, and what that has to do with strategic empathy? Well, it is the measuring modality by which we assess if the information that we are using in our planning, in the plans, left of bang, and what happens when the conflict starts, and what goes on after that. If these things are paid attention to, aligned with critical thinking, and aligned with, of course, I'm going to spend the lion's share of today discussing this very thing, aligned with that strategic empathy, and by the way, grand strategic empathy. So, if you had to rewind a couple times to catch what I just told you, my apologies, but I feel it as if it's a key preamble to what we're going to discuss today. By the way, I promise you that here I am in the rental trying to record this, and that my studio acoustics are not optimal, but bear with me because I've been trying to do this even while we're awaiting our new bunker complex location in order to stick to my fortnightly cadence of issuing podcast episodes. Now, I remind you, we're going to be discussing critical thinking today. And what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is thinking about thinking to improve your thinking through better thinking. I think Mortimer Adler would even be proud of that keen summary of what we'll be discussing today. The reason why most people don't think critically is because critical thinking is hard work. You have to put your shoulder to the wheel rhetorically and rationally, and I've used this word before, prismatically. And prismatically means that I'm looking at it from all sides of a given equation, whether this is a physics problem or a conflict problem. Not saying that one can necessarily conflate both, but you have to keep in mind that when you're doing these things, sometimes you will come to conclusions that are uncomfortable. You will be forced to face the fact or observation that what you're using in your logical syllogisms to arrive at your conclusions may be things that fly in the face of conventional wisdom or are things that you haven't spoken of or thought of before. So before we do that, I want to introduce you to a very simple concept, in that situational awareness, situational understanding, and its impact on what we call the OODA loop. Hats off to Mark McGrath, who is, in my mind, maybe one of the most significant living heirs to Colonel John Boyd's advocacy of the OODA loop. This would be situational awareness and situational understanding. Situational awareness is simply knowing, well, what's going on around you, what are the observable effects, what are the observations that even lend themselves to ending in these effects, and what's going on. This could be as simple as you're aware of your surroundings. Maybe you're employing Colonel Jeff Cooper's color code for situational awareness and things like that. This happens in every gamut of every moment of your waking hours. Now, what's situational understanding? Situational understanding would be where you actually take what you are aware of, what you can process, all the evidence you have before you and in your mind, or if you're doing this on a project basis, what your team members have discovered and shared with you. And then you come to an understanding not only of what you saw, but how you saw it, because how you saw it is also going to dictate what the why is going to be in your certitude of establishing what happened. And if you know what happened and you can discover why it happened and you can extrapolate that into the future to anticipate that this may happen again as a result of you plumbing the whys of this phenomenon, this is what's called intent. Intent would be, in the military parlance and argot, that very thing that a commander at the top of whatever pyramid you happen to work for, from the platoon to the army and everything in between, what that commander wants you to achieve in this little segmented portion of the greater war. Which brings us to the OODA loop that impacts both your situational awareness, SA, and situational understanding, SU. OODA loop would be observe, orient, decide, and act. Colonel John Boyd, the major developer of the F-16 fighter in the U.S. Air Force in the 60s and 70s, was the one who, I would not say he invented this concept, but he cobbled together all the components that existed in human reality and put them together and came to this conclusion. And the very best way I can describe it, for those of you not familiar, is that here's how the OODA loop is employed. Observe, you are driving a car, you observe an intersection in front of you. There's a green light, there's a red light. You orient, maybe you're making a left turn going forward or making a right turn. You decide on which lane you're going to go on, and then you act when the light turns red or green, or the left or right signal is activated. That's the simplest way one could describe this. Now, I want to demonstrate to you how Boyd didn't necessarily invent this, as I mentioned. He did observe it and, of course, created the OODA loop. But these things have been with us, and we're confining ourselves to discussing war and conflict in this instance when we grasp examples and things like that. The Romans did this. The Greeks did this when Marius's mules emerged in the Roman army at the turn of the millennium or close to it. That first millennium, by the way, Anno Domini. All successful legionary commanders were using an OODA loop. Hannibal was using an OODA loop. These, I would argue, have been used all the time. Some well, some not so well. Because remember, military conflict, there are winners and losers. That's from the University of the Intuitively Obvious. And one discovers that with this OODA loop, it has been occurring for the longest time. So I want to give you a rather contemporary example of this that occurred well before Boyd articulated his notions of the OODA loop. So in the Pacific Theater of Operations during World War II in 1942, an aerial combat tactic was created by a Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch so that slower American F-4F Wildcats to defeat the very light and agile Japanese A6M0s in the PTO. They referred to it as the Thatch Weave, and it involved two fighters flying in tandem. This is where I wish that I could have an active YouTube video so you could watch my hands flying around as if I was having an epileptic fit, using a coordinated weaving crossover maneuver to lure, trap, and destroy chasing enemy planes. So when a Zero targeted one Wildcat, the two American planes would turn toward each other, crossing paths. This forced the chasing Zero to either pass in front of the second American plane's guns or turn away, allowing the first pilot to reverse the position. The combat debut for this, first used effectively at the Battle of Midway, where the small number of Wildcats had to hold off a larger force of Zeros. Now, this changed American defensive philosophy from relying on speed to using precise, cooperative team tactics, crucial in early Pacific campaigns like Guadalcanal. By the way, there is this awesome history podcast out there with Seth Paradin, Bill Tody, and John Parshall. I have been consuming this podcast. I started as a completist. Of course I did. I started from the very first episode, and I'm making my way through them. Amazing. It's just the best stuff. And they did a great overview of the Guadalcanal campaign. And of course, as before, Guadalcanal was a pivot point, a turning point. One could call it the pivot point of the entire Pacific War in a lot of respects. A couple great books to recommend is James Hornfisher's Neptune's Inferno, which talks about the naval disasters and triumphs of the U.S. Navy in the Guadalcanal campaign. And I can't recommend more highly enough the magisterial multi-volume history of Guadalcanal by Jeffrey Cox. So if you get an opportunity, I'll put those in the show notes so that you can check them out for yourselves. But I find those probably to be the final word right now on what happened at that time. Now, I know many of you hear me bagging on the professional military education system, from boot camp to initial officer training to the War College, which is supposed to be the apex predator in professional military collegiate education, not to mention the very sorry state of the service academies, which I would love to see burned to the ground, defunded, and all existing students matriculated into non-Ivy League ROTC programs to finish their route to commissioning, because they have been so destructive. And I would suggest to you that the sorry state of our professional military education is yet another component of why, since 1945, this trail of tears of defeat and stalemate for American arms has been so consistent. And yes, I continue to be a pariah to the war colleges, to the irregular warfare initiative, and all of the education organizations that are out there doing military things every day, because I refuse to buy into their martial malpractice. Yet, sometimes I do find good stuff out there that happens to be published, let's say, in Parameters, the Army War College Quarterly, which I do enjoy, although I have to be very selective about what I read in there. Or I do read it, but take some of those things, if not half of them, with a grain of salt, because not only are they poorly written and poorly researched, but they are part of a narrative engine from the advocacy tanks — there's no such thing as a think tank — that are trying to press for greater and greater budgets for the DOW, the Department of War. I almost said DOD. And they're the ones who are the advocates to continue this unabated defeat and stalemate of American arms. The title of it was Developing Strategic Empathy and Perspective Taking in Military Leaders. The abstract reads as follows, quote, Strategic empathy requires stepping into the minds of an adversary, competitor, collaborator, or ally to understand their motives and interests from their point of view. The core mechanism that enables strategic empathy is perspective taking. Importantly, strategic empathy is gaining primacy in our warfighting decision spaces and increasingly recognized as a leadership imperative. End of quote in my editorial assertion. No, that's not the case at all. This is not gaining primacy in the warfighting. This is not gaining primacy at the operational, strategic, or strategic level. It is dismissed. It is disabused, and it is something that they refuse to consider because, for the most part, for instance, the military intelligence community does not seem to have the moral courage to step up with the knowledge that they have, again, prismatically, that would defy or make uncomfortable the flag officer that they may be briefing, that flag officer is all wet, washed up, and not thinking correctly, and this is what the enemy's worst or most likely course of action is going to be. This will continue to be the case. The Army, for instance, has embraced something called mission command, which is a derivation of Auftragstaktik, which for my listeners who have listened to me before, if this happens to be your first podcast, it will be the first time you've heard it from me, but I always beat the drum on this, which is that one has in this case, the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht were the ones who pioneered Auftragstaktik mission command, where it was left to the character, competence, and capability of the officers under the commanding officer who gave the intent for the execution of a mission to jig and jag and move and shoot and do things according to what happens right of bang, because all the greatest plans go awry and Murphy steps in because Murphy's got the biggest vote when it comes to combat conditions, from the smallest to the largest conflicts that they happen to be involved in, and they have to use what one would call the characterization of their martial competence to fight their way through all the changes they will encounter that they did not countenance in the plans issued. Let's go back to this summary here. So, quote, with professional military education, however, how leaders cultivate this complex cognitive capacity remains a gap. We introduce an instructional method, perspective papers, designed to further the ability to shift mental frames away from one's own viewpoint to another's viewpoint, while suspending judgment. Perspective papers immerse students in the seemingly simple yet cognitively challenging experience of addressing questions through multiple lenses, again prismatically, other than their own. It's harder than it sounds. Students practice this process iteratively during a 10-week course at a senior service college, most likely a war college. The method has been utilized for over a decade with consistent effect and operational application. We include unsolicited communications from students 3, 5, 10 years post their participation in the course to reflect longitudinal impact. Don't you love academic jargon? Additionally, we offer guidance to fellow military professional education educators for employing the instructional method in their learning spaces. We argue the development of perspective-taking capacities throughout professional PME facilitates desired joint officer learning outcomes and furthers operational success, and of quote, that's filled with jargon, and of course, that appears to be something that one would read in a professional military journal. But reading between the lines, what one discovers is that, again, we have been champions of prismatic thinking and contrarian thinking and 10th man thinking here at Chasing Ghost World Headquarters for the longest time. And all of a sudden we see here in September 2025 that recognition is starting to take hold. This happens to be the abstract for the 21-page article that is in this issue of the Journal of Military Learning. We are going to fast forward to their conclusion, and I wanted to put in a PSA very quickly concerning conclusions in the last chapters of books. Something that I've done ever since college, because I read a lot when I can, both audiobooks and real books and Kindle, is that, man, there's so many books, so little time. I'm going to assume room temperature well before I've consumed every book that I want to. How do I determine, for instance, if a nonfiction book, a tome that may be 300, 400, 500, 600 pages, is worth my time? I have found a tried and true method that I use, which is this. I read the conclusion first of any nonfiction book that I take on. And it does two things. Number one, it tells me whether that book is worth reading. And number two, it allows me to have the, if I may borrow the term from the military, the operational and strategic understanding of the intent and what the authors are after, so that when I start the book, if I decide that it may be worth my time and there's profit in it, I'll have a much greater idea of their situational awareness and understanding framework than I would if I hadn't done that in the first place. PSA concluded. What are their conclusions in this 2025 article? Well, let's take the first paragraph, which is very interesting. Quote, operational design requires analysis of actors in the operational environment, including their capabilities and intent, psychological characteristics, decision-making, and relationships with other actors. Perspective taking enables this analysis, making it less dependent on observer biases. Joint planning guidance suggests that perspective taking may be particularly important for center of gravity analysis, noting, quote in the quote, a rational decision in the threat's perspective may appear irrational from the friendly perspective, end of quote. I want to repeat that quote within a quote. A rational decision in the threat's perspective may appear irrational from the friendly perspective. That's Joint Chiefs of Staff 2020, and I am interested in where that came from, because I know that comes from the University of the Intuitively Obvious, but I don't see this practiced in the wars that America decides to engage in, especially wars of choice. Oh, by the way, which happen to be all the wars America's been involved in since 1945. One final extract from this article, which I will post in the show notes. Understanding these multiple and diverse perspectives requires seeking more information, and of course, access to current intelligence. Possessing the cognitive agility to shift between differing lenses and navigate differing interests is equally imperative. Although the incursion did not substantially affect the course of war in the short term, it highlights the importance of engaging complex cognition when a pattern break or operational surprise occurs. Expanding leaders' cognitive capacity to consider a range of views before such a pattern break occurs helps prepare them to better respond to the adversary behavior in crisis or conflict. End of quote. So I find this fascinating. And of course, a lot of this is obvious to those of us who have labored as critical thinkers or observers of current conflict. And a lot of us always scratch our heads and think ex post facto, well, why the hell did they do that? Why didn't they take this into consideration? I would point to a contemporary example that Paul Bremer becomes the Roman-style proconsul in Iraq once Bolshevik II declares victory in the Iraq War. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, I am going to make sure that every member of Saddam Hussein's military is no longer a uniform-wearing member of that military or participating in military activities whatsoever. Now think this through. Even if you don't look at this through a military lens, how wise is it to take this vast panoply of folks who formerly served in a military organization and say, we'd like you to become cobblers, dentists, doctors, or day laborers instead of doing what you do, releasing them into the wild, and you don't think that they would provide the baseline instructional or tactical or otherwise, of an emerging guerrilla army among the guerrilla factions in the Iraq War. Same thing would occur in Afghanistan, and in a smaller state of nature, it would occur in Syria and Libya. And of course, we all know when we examine the after effects of those very poor policy decisions, what that has done for conflict in the Middle East as far as the U.S. and the West is concerned. Now, I want to mention something that I was involved with for a period of time, which is something called sense-making in the U.S. military. Sense-making is the active, often social process of turning ambiguous, complex, or unexpected information into meaning to guide action. It involves constructing a plausible rather than perfectly accurate understanding of a situation by connecting cues to previous experiences, often summarized as, quote, how we structure the unknown, end of quote. There are books out there on sense making. I will post one of those in the show notes. And what you'll discover is that sense making, critical thinking, and what we were just describing as far as strategic empathy are all married to each other through various connective tissue in this prismatic critical thinking lens that I'm trying to make you appreciate for why it is so important when one goes to war, conducts the war, and drives to a conclusion of said war so that one can either conduct stability operations afterwards or leave entirely once one has equipped the new government, because of course there's going to be a new government after a conflict, with the means by which they can sustain themselves. Now I'm going to put another framework in your rucksack, and this would be the Cynefin framework. Now this was created in 1999, that's interesting. I would say it's discovered, by Dave Snowden, probably no relation to the other Snowden, when he worked for IBM Global Services. It's been described as a sense-making device. By the way, Cynefin's a Welsh word for habitat. Cynefin offers 5 decision-making context or domains. Those are clear, also known as simple or obvious, complicated, complex, chaotic, and confusion or disorder. That helps managers to identify how they perceive situations and make sense of their own and other people's behavior. Now, I don't know how often this very framework has been used in military planning, military operations, conflicts, and such, but I think that if one were to examine this, you'd find that it would be very, very helpful in especially third world and developing world conflict situations if one used this lens, even in the latest conflict in Iran. Those of you old enough to remember the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, remember that Donald Rumsfeld used a phrase called "there are unknown unknowns." Rumsfeld stated, quote, "Reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns, there are things we know, we also know there are known unknowns. That is, say we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tends to be the difficult ones," end of quote. And as those of you who have listened to me for a longer and perennial time know that I'm fascinated by Nassim Taleb's concepts of fragility and anti-fragility, and I would tell you that this would be a black swan event when it's an unknown unknown that happens to be an unpinned grenade that lands in one's lap that you weren't anticipating. By the way, not only anticipating cultural incompetence, but anticipating Murphy's Law and the way it will insinuate itself into every part of the fabric of conflict that this is yet another difficulty when it comes to conducting war. All wars are conducted and started by politicians when they say that, well, this will be over in a day or a week, and by the way, it never turns out that way. So I've introduced you to concepts, frameworks, ways of thinking, ways of approaching, prismatic, syntopical, comprehensive, all of these things that are a necessary component of military intelligence, political intelligence, all those things that a business may even employ where they're trying to establish a baseline of understanding that goes beyond awareness. So in a nutshell, strategic empathy is that left of bang, and I would hope they would use it right of bang, is going to be all those notions bundled together that allow you to mind read intent, try to suss out and figure out who the players are, what the plays are, what the capabilities are, what the disposition and composition of the armed forces are, and all of these things that one would bundle together into that eventual situational understanding to inform the plans that you have. Now, as a military historian, of course, I have a blind spot for military history, and I may even exaggerate its importance. And I want to take you back in time, once again, to World War II. The Wehrmacht General Staff did not employ military historians, and much to the disappointment of von Moltke Sr. and von Moltke Jr., in the modern academic sense. Instead, it operated a dedicated historical division staffed by professional general staff officers who were specifically trained to analyze past conflicts for practical application. I repeat again, specifically trained to analyze past conflicts for practical education. Up in Pennsylvania, we have something called the U.S. Army Center of Military History, which puts out a lot of stuff, employs military historians, professional military historians, even though I would tell you, as a further aside, that the unprofessional military historian, I mentioned the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. There are a number of great U.S. and British, especially, military historians who have YouTube channels and things like that that are just terrific. This is probably one of those historical enterprises in the history of academia and popular consumption in which uncredentialed amateur historians can be just as good, if not better, in my mind, than those who are professionally trained as historiographers and historians. And thanks to that, military history does have a new lease on life because of the internet, Kindle, and not having to be gatekept by the major publishers on what is permitted as military history and what is not. So there's that center, and I don't know if the U.S. Army uses them as a mode of the general staff and joint staff, as it were, to inform all their planning activities, whether it's the warfighting activities for anticipated conflicts with Canada, Japan, Great Britain, all of those unlikely, to those that are more likely as major regional contingencies like Iraq, Iran, and Taiwan, and everything in between. I would love to hear from my listeners, since I tend to be more Army-centric, since that is the service I served in myself as both a uniformed member and a contractor. Maybe the other services have great military history enclaves. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know if that happens to be the case. And then there's something extraordinary but underused that the Army does called the Center for Army's Lessons Learned, in which the whole lessons learned modality is recorded and kept for posterity. I remember that some of my signal successes in the U.S. Army have been the result of them asking me to assist as the intelligence guy in assessing either a real-world event that we were going to go into or a training event that we were going to go into, because I would be the only guy who would go to the files and I would get the actual or virtual dust off of all the lessons learned I could dig up that were appropriate to it, read them over, and see if they had any bearing whatsoever to the enterprise that we were about to embark on. I would urge you that if you presently are in uniform or you have any influence on this, to grab people by the lapels and force them to use the Center for Army Lessons Learned, because there's a lot of gold in our hills. Back to the historical division of the Wehrmacht, and I'm not going to pronounce the German name for that because I would not do it any credit. The German General Staff maintained a robust internal culture of historical study. Their goal was to extract eternal truths of strategy and operational art. They had officer historians. Members of this branch were called demigods by regular soldiers for their intellectual focus. They were professional soldiers first who spent years analyzing archives to write official histories of past wars. The War Diary. During World War II, the General Staff mandated meticulous record-keeping. Senior officers like General Franz Holder, Chief of the General Staff from 38 to 42, kept detailed daily diaries that functioned as real-time historical records. There was a Historical Research Institute. By 1936, the Army formalized this work through the Army Institute for Military Historical Research. Now, how did this affect doctrine? Now, the historians on staff were responsible for institutionalizing specific concepts that defined the Wehrmacht's fighting style. For instance, they would look at the campaigns of Frederick the Great. The staff viewed the Prussian campaigns of the 18th century as the gold standard for high-level strategy and professional discipline. They looked at the Reichswehr in World War I in the 1920s under General Hans von Seeckt. The staff conducted a massive historical review of World War I failures. This study, involving over 57 committees, directly led to the development of combined arms maneuver warfare and all of the changes as a result of technology, communications, characterization of combatant officers and combatant NCOs, and everything in between, which led to the Blitzkrieg and the successes from 1939 to early 1942. And then, of course, we had the zombification of the Wehrmacht, which took almost 3 years to die as a result of Hitler saying that Auftragstactic Mission Command and the non-micromanagement of armed forces would be disposed of, and the strategic and grand strategic chess moves would not be the province of the tactical and operational units, but simply all edicts issued from Berlin. If you're really interested in the nuts and bolts of this process, there's 3 books I can offer you, which is Walter Gerlitz's book, History of the German General Staff, 1657 to 1945, Franz Halder, the Halder Diaries, and that's the primary source for General Staff operations during the early war, and James S. Coram did a great book on the roots of Blitzkrieg, and he talks about how Seeckt used historical analysis to reform the army. By the way, Coram is also, if I recall, a biographer of John Boyd, Colonel John Boyd of Odaloop and F-16 fame. So those are great ways for you to get greater appreciation of Auftragstactic and the conduct of probably one of the most formidable combat formations in the 20th century, which would be the Wehrmacht, but not to be overshadowed by, as I have mentioned in previous podcasts, and I'll tease you with this, the incredible transformation of the Soviet Red Army from 1943 to 1945, because they were taking notes, they were taking names, and they were making institutional learning organizational changes that would see them at the gates of Berlin from March to April 1945. Because we all know, and I am not saying this in jest, it was the Russians who won Europe in World War II and not the Allies. So what does all of this mean? Maybe some of you have heard me mention a phrase that I coined called strategic deficit disorder. This is the means by which the United States military, arguably the most expensive and arguably, formally, the most formidable combat force on planet Earth after 1945, yet hallmarks of defeat, stalemate, and just not getting the job done would be the primary mark on history of U.S. arms in the 20th century, and of course, moving on into this first 25 years of the new millennium in the 21st century, and it would continue on unabated. So I am not necessarily assigning blame to this as the primary reason that the U.S. and the West consistently lose in their wars, but this is a consistent motif of American arms, if not Western arms, since the conclusion of World War II. And I do think that there is an element of willful historical amnesia where, for some reason or other, the U.S. almost refuses to take a rather empirical, historiographical look at conflicts in the past and tries to look at those to inform their present strategic and cultural understanding of foes that they are taking on. For instance, we all know what happened. I had mentioned Paul Bremer and what he did, and that was just one of a raft of mistakes that was made by the American proconsul in Iraq that led to a protracted conflict after George Bush's declaration of victory. Same thing happened in Afghanistan. The same thing happened in Libya. Libya is dethroned of Gaddafi for good or bad or ill, whatever you may think of his reign in that country. By the way, they had an incipient nuclear program that, believably in my mind, unlike Iran, was on the brink of success to actually develop nuclear weapons. Yet another reason that he was deposed in the most violent and despicable fashion. No one's defending these cretins and reprobates that rule these Middle Eastern countries, but it seems that consistently the ones who tend to take their place, like the former Al-Qaeda head chopper, who is now the president of Syria, things continue to get worse and worse. It's much like presidential elections in the United States, where you think, well, the new guy in the awful office can't possibly be as bad as the one that was in there. Well, America, hold my beer. It's going to be even worse than it was. I've spoken of the original gangsters for coin in the West in the 20th century, and that would be T.E. Lawrence, Michael Collins, and General Leto Vorbeck in Africa during World War I. And there are a host of other more minor luminaries who did read the books, who did take the pulse of the society that they were presently in at the time. And they measured it in a fashion where they took into account what that culture could do, would do, and wouldn't do. They were the ones who consistently racked up success after success. No doubt there were some defeats, but their successes far outnumbered those defeats. And I would say that with those three personages I just mentioned, One was an inveterate reader, that would be Lawrence, and by the way, an amateur, if not semi-professional cartographer, who knew the way things worked, and they didn't work by right angles in the Middle East. They worked by blood, by clan, by faction, by relationship, over generations past, that would remain at the forefront of contemporary memory in those countries. The 800-year collapse of the British brutal rule of Ireland was a result of Collins and his cast of characters not only taking advantage of their cultural IQ for being Irishmen, but using that as a lever with their historical knowledge to get the gains that they did in concert with what happened to Great Britain in World War I period. And Leto Vorbeck came from the old school of the Reichswehr, not necessarily the Wehrmacht, because he was in World War I, not World War II. He was a reader. He paid attention. He had the character. And by the way, with all of these individuals, I am not saying that everything they did was something to fly your flag on. They certainly made mistakes. And when you look at von Leto's experience in very turn of the 20th century Germany in its German colonies, there's some things there that you don't want to write home about. But nonetheless, the three of these folks thrived and did great things by reading the room or rooms properly. Fast forward to 2002 during Millennium Challenge, and you have Marine Corps General Van Riper, who manages to destroy a computerized war game by instituting a symmetrical and, one would say, outside the military infrastructure answers and tactics, techniques, and procedures to spoil the pre-planned war game for them. They stopped the war game. Eventually, I would say that they told him to go away, but I think they fired Van Riper from the game because he showed that an astute and culturally, if not historically, observant foe could read the room for the United States and know what to do to stop the U.S. in its tracks in its expeditionary warfare. This happened. This isn't fantasy. The wartime exploits of those folks I mentioned at the turn of the 20th century, bookmarked by what Van Riper did in a computerized war game, and everything in between, shows that there is tremendous benefit to providing historical context, providing cultural context, to trying to read the mind of the threat, as it were, or your opponent and antagonist in warfare, and maybe even assign a biographical desk to a number of savvy officers and maybe even civilian historians who would read the literature, read the historical studies of conflict for a given country, and try to determine what the pulse was of how they worked in the past, how they work now, and extrapolating from that a single most accurate picture of how they're going to work in the future if you plan on fighting them. Consistently, we have found, as I just delineated just in the Middle Eastern expeditionary conflicts that the U.S. has taken part in, the U.S. has not read the room, and the U.S. is the most expensive and arguably largest and technically sophisticated military in the world that is consistently bested by people who don't have what the U.S. has, nor its Western allies. So here is my ask of the U.S. military establishment. First and foremost, I want to provide this proviso. How does one win a counterinsurgency? Number one answer, you never get involved in that in the first place. But if you must, take the time forensically and historically to examine who your enemy is, or bundle or alliance of enemies or axis of enemies are that you're going to fight, and ask yourself, what must I do to close this fight in the shortest time possible? what diplomatic initiatives are possible. I talked about Colonel John Boyd, and John Boyd wrote this fantastic and massive PowerPoint presentation where he talked about a couple of things strategically. Well, actually, hundreds of things. But I took away a very simple lesson that he had in there. And that lesson is this. If you're in a war, what you do is you bring your allies close and you isolate your enemy. That is the core, for the most part, of strategic thinking in conflict. That was done brilliantly in a lot of ways in the U.S. and Western adventures in World War II, not so much in the adventures of the past, and of course, all of that was ignored in its totality for the Iraq War, for the Afghanistan War, and Obama's entries into Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa in obeisance to the operational and strategic aims of certain countries in the Middle East. My ask is a bit more complex because I think the professional military education system in the United States is beyond redemption. And what has to be done, and this will not be done, is the whole thing must be burned to the ground. The War College faculties must all be fired for the most part because they are so saturated and infatuated with the woke mind virus and the orthodoxy of ensuring that all of the things not important to conflict are prioritized over those things that are very important to the practical application of war and military technology and tactics, techniques, and procedures. And every U.S. military academy, West Point, the Air Force Academy, the Naval Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, maybe not the last, must be either severely reformed or closed in their entirety. And as I mentioned before in this episode, all remaining students at the service academies matriculated into non-Ivy League ROTC programs. Why do I say non-Ivy League? Because I think that all Ivy League ROTC programs should be abolished, because those are the centers and loci of wokedom in America and the diseases that come from that. And as I've often told some of my civilian colleagues, if you bring somebody who's graduated from a woke college, especially an Ivy League college, with a non-STEM degree, you are bringing a bomb into your firm that will not increase your ROI, will not make your stock prosper, and will not make you produce or manufacture goods and services that are good for people to purchase. So as Sun Tzu and Sun Pin, his grandson, told us, well, a long time ago, know your enemy. It seems those three words are intuitively obvious. I wouldn't even call them counterintuitive. I wouldn't even say that they don't have street sense to them. But those things are always in the hazard in American military minds, as far as I can see historically and contemporaneously. There was a book that the CIA published called The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. And in there were warnings of institutional capture of analysts who would deliver analytical products that would align themselves with the prejudices of the supervisory and leadership framework that they work for. And I think it is rather obvious that's exactly what happened in the intelligence services, and that's exactly what has happened at the joint level and even the service level in the U.S. military. In the end, it is time for those who provision these analytics to have the moral courage to be able to say to those who request said products and analyses that the emperor has no clothes, and sir, you are categorically wrong for the following empirical and anecdotal reasons, and entertaining them with historiographical reasons why they're all wet. So what does this come down to? It comes down to that 1930s leather notebook that I have in my office from IBM that simply reads, think. And by the way, as I said, thinking is hard work. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is Bill. I'm really looking forward to comments on my Substack concerning this episode to tell me where I'm wrong, where I'm right, and how we can improve this, I would suggest to you, existentially dangerous situation in the U.S. military, if not the government at large, in their refusal to acknowledge that history rhymes. Okay, if you enjoyed this episode, please, at the podcast vendor of your choice that you elect to use to listen to me bloviate, leave a 4 or 5 star review. And if you leave a narrative review, I am so happy that you've done so. I am now at 59 paid subscribers on my Substack, and I am eternally grateful for your solicitude in supporting the efforts. Helps me buy books and do those kind of things. Paid subscribers get some of these benefits. They get an occasional podcast screech from me that is rather short, that is called Microburst. I have a CG paid subscriber chat just for my paid subscriber. We have a Signal chat, and you will tend to get your podcast episode that I've issued on a fortnightly basis earlier than the non-paid subscribers. So if you have a chance, I'd love for you to get a paid subscription. But if not, I appreciate your listenership nonetheless. If you think that family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances may enjoy what I have to say, mention my podcast to them. Either Chasing Ghost, which is this one, or War Notes, my conventional assessment of the world at large. So thank you very much for listening. This is Bill, out.